Dave tells the story of Rick leveling off, right? So he gets his life together, he stops using alcohol, gets a steady job, and is happy. It's fine.
Yeah.
But then it's time to level up. And I think that that's the other message here, is that there's always room for more growth, to push yourself further, to not settle into a new pattern, if you will. Because especially if you have an addictive, I don't know if personality is the right term, but you can get addicted to a certain level, right? It doesn't have to be alcoholism. Like,
Right.
I was talking about, like, I realized something the other day, that I was addicted to something emotionally. I don't remember what it was offhand, but it was like, wow, I have this almost need to have a certain emotion, right? To have that was so compelling to me to like, oh, I need to do this, I need to do this. And it alters your behavior. So we all have the ability to be addicted to something. We think alcohol, we think drugs, but emotional addictions, which hang around from childhood, can be very impactful to someone's life. So if you have like a negative self-belief, like I've had most of my life, that I'm not good enough, that's what it was. That's that addicting behavior. It's like you keep coming back to that. You keep coming back to that because it proves your point that you're not good enough. So all the failures are like, well, yeah, of course you failed. You're not good enough. So then you're almost looking for opportunities to convince yourself you're not good enough. Yeah. It's, in a way, an emotional addiction. Yeah. But it doesn't have to be.
Right. Yeah. Whether or not he has we assume he has some closure from this. We assume it's something positive. Maybe I assume that just because that's my perspective, but we don't know exactly what is the outcome. Although when you read back, and I did the same thing, I read back those strange excerpts, and you read about how there's a sad, apologetic standpoint. And I'm sorry that you went through that, and I never didn't love you. There's that piece of closure that might have been all that Rick actually needed from Gil in order to level up, to be unstuck, to live up to his potential. Now, I will say, I heard that some of our friends were asking more about the story because I knew the author. I don't know if this story is necessarily autobiographical. The only part that I can confirm is that Dave did indeed play beach volleyball. So again, I don't know if this is his story or not. I actually never heard these stories until I read the book.
Dave Oliver was a teacher of yours, a yoga teacher of yours. As you said earlier, you don't necessarily know if this was autobiographical or not, but can you talk to me a little bit about how this came to be, or how this book came to happen, and your experience with Dave, and how maybe that ties into this book?
Yeah. So Dave was one of my yoga teachers. He passed in 2014. He did have a battle with cancer, so he was aware of his illness. I mean, we all know we're going to die one day, but some of us don't know as specific. The thing I can tell you, just from the perspective of the Dave that I know, he's an incredible yoga teacher. He's also known as being a great storyteller. So in the type of yoga that was his primary type of yoga, which is Ashtanga yoga, it follows, there's a lot of myths as far as the Ashtanga yoga and characters and all these elaborate stories, the Bhagavad Gita being one of these stories that's very prominent. A lot of the pose names derive from these characters. So aside from being a great yoga teacher as far as the asana, the physical practice, he was a great storyteller of these stories. And he could tell you these stories that, I kid you not, if you read them in a book, you would be completely bored by it. But the way he tells it, it's like watching a, multi-million-dollar movie unfold in your own imagination. He would often tell these stories while we're in Shavasana, which is the final resting pose, where your eyes are closed, you're laying down. So you're in your own imagination, and he's telling you these stories. He's telling the stories in his own way. He very much is like that surfer dude. I mean, instead of wearing yoga pants, he wore like board shorts to practice in. He always had two things in his pocket, a comb, because he liked to perfect the coif, and chapstick, because he talked a lot, so he needed to rehydrate the lips. Just one of the most warming, welcoming teachers, but like cool, like a surfer dude.
Beach volleyball there.
Yeah, yeah.
One of my absolute favorite stories is the first time I went into practice with him while I was pregnant. I was fairly newly pregnant, so I wasn't showing. And I went over and as I did, I always would tell whoever was teaching that I was pregnant and that I was going to be modifying. And I said, well, Dave, I need to let you know that I'm pregnant now. And he goes, oh, really? He's like, okay, I have a modification for you. And he says, okay, stand like this. All right, put your feet like this. All right, bring your right knee in a little bit. Okay, bring your left knee in until like my knees are touching. And then he says, if you do that again next time, you won't be pregnant. I was not expecting that. And then it like the joke just landed. And then he just sort of smiled. He's like okay. Like, we're done here. Like, okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We've had our moment. Now let's go to yoga class.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's cool. So it's that same allowing that Gigi does for Rick in the story. It's being someone who's there to help, but also allowing each person to have their own experience and to take from it what they will, and to show up, but not feel like you have to be the star of the show, right? You're a supporting actor. Oh, and I didn't answer all of your questions. The only other question you had for me was how this book came to be. So I know that he wrote the book before his passing, but it was not published until I think about 2 years after he passed. Several of his students, as well as his wife, who is still a yoga teacher, an amazing yoga teacher herself, actually published the book. I can also tell you that his wife, Cheryl, has the opening lines from the book on the very opening of it, tattooed on her body, written in Dave's handwriting.
Oh, that's really cool.
And the part of the lines we're talking about is, even though I'm as far away from you now as I've ever been, I've never been closer. My heart knows no separation. Communication is easier now, purer, refined. I'm always communicating, always there. So it's a very special place that this story can exist. And I love the message. I love that it leaves it open for all of us to interpret what happened or what happens next.
Yeah. Well, and I love, just one final thought. I love what you mentioned a little bit ago, that after you read the end, you went back and reread the excerpts from Gil, right? Essentially the automatic writing components. And I think that's a really neat way to do it, because I didn't do that. But now, having just finished it and you reading that first part, I have a very different way now that I'm reading that information and how it's connecting into the greater message of, what we have interpreted the book to be. So I think that's a really cool idea, to go back and just reread the Gil's parts in each piece.
With a new perspective.
Yeah, with a new perspective.
Well, thank you so much for being here. This concludes our book club for The Pen by Dave Oliver. Now, if you had fun joining us, we've got another one coming up. And Rob, would you like to tell us about our next book?
So my area of expertise here in Painted Porch Strategy is communication. And I mentioned that I went up and talked to a stranger at a recent rally. So we are going to pick up Malcolm Gladwell's book, Talking to Strangers. A little bit of a different context, but that same idea is what you can learn from people by digging in and being open-minded. So I'm very curious. I've never read a Malcolm Gladwell book. I admire his thinking ability. I've heard several interviews with him. So I'm excited to dive in with you two, and you join us.
So we'll be sharing more information about that soon. We'll be kicking that one off, in the next week here for March. And we look forward to hearing some of your perspectives, both regarding the pen. We'd love to hear what your big takeaways were, and your responses. And then also, as we dive into this next book, Talking with Strangers, it's a slightly different approach to the idea, but it's helping you, again, a little start to tune that dial in a little bit to understanding the difference between what people say and what people do, and how they're communicating both verbally and non-verbally.
Yeah.
So be there, be square.
Yes. Well, thank you so much. And we are Painted Porch Strategies. We are a team that is rooted in Stoic philosophy, and we work with individuals and companies to just make them the best they can possibly be.